Well, I'm very pleased that we've managed to persuade Lesley Downer to come in and talk to us about women, Japan's powerful women. So Japan is probably not a country one associates very much with powerful women, but it has some powerful women through its history, and Lesley is going to tell us about them. So Lesley is an author, and as she's put it here herself, an all-round Japan buff. So her first book, On the Narrow Road to the Deep North, came out absolutely ages ago, but it was read by my mother, whose birthday it is today, and so my mother is a Lesley Downer fan as well. That was, I think, walking in the footsteps of Basho, and I'm sure you've all done a lot of walking today, probably more to come. So think Basho as you do so. But I think Lesley, most of her work has been historical novels based in Japan. And in the course of that, she's done a great deal of research on Japanese history. And this then caused her to be asked to produce a book in a series of books, short histories. But she was in charge of the shortest history of Japan. So obviously that covers Japanese women as well, but is much more general, broad history of Japan. But I think that's probably all the introduction that Lesley needs from me. So over to you, Lesley.
Minasama, konbanwa. Hi everybody. Thank you very much for braving the tube strike and being here. It's fantastic. And Jason, thank you very much for that very kind, sweet introduction. So, oh my God, what have I done? The shortest history of Japan. So when I was asked to write the shortest history of Japan, it seemed to me to be a marvelous opportunity to bring together actually some 45 years of love of and interest in Japan and its history. It was a kind of coda to a whole lifetime lived in and around Japan. And the first thing I asked myself was, okay, where do I start? And that was fairly easy because I love Japanese pottery, and it turns out that the Japanese were the world's first potters. So in 14,500 BC, when we were still in the Ice Age, and there was a land bridge linking Japan to the Asian continent, some people, probably women, took some handfuls of soil and began to shape it into a kind of pot shape. And then some of these pot-shaped items made of clay went into the bonfire, probably by accident, and the people realized that this made them rock hard. So this was a phenomenal technology. With pots, you could store your food, you could carry your food, and you no longer had to only roast your food over a spit. You could also boil food, you could simmer food, so you could make your food soft, and you could eat foods that were not edible raw, like chestnuts. So it widely expanded people's diets, and was a much greater, much further advance in technology than the internet. So then the Ice Age came to an end, and the sea levels rose, and the people living at the far eastern edge of the Asian continent found themselves on the islands that we now know as Japan. And at this point, there was a really wonderful climate. It became very warm, and the people could pluck food, they could pluck fish from the oceans, they could pick fruit from the trees, there were deer and boar that they could hunt, and all in all, they led a very prosperous and easy life. They were hunter-gatherers, but they led such an easy life that they were able to settle down in communities, even though nearly all peoples only settle down in communities when they're farming. But these hunter-gatherers settled down, and they were so prosperous, food was so easy to find, that they were able to specialize. Not everybody had to go hunter-gathering. So some people specialized in making pots. Let's hope this works. Yes. And so by about 3000 BC, they were making really magnificent pots like this, which presumably you all know. You can see these pots in the British Museum. They're big, they're magnificent, they're flame design or wave design, and they all have this rope design, which is why these people are known as the Jomon. So obviously I was going to begin my shortest history of Japan with the Jomon. And equally obviously, having been a journalist in my time, I was going to end it as near to yesterday as I could. So, quick bit of mathematics, that meant I would have to cover 16,500 years of Japanese history in 50,000 words, which was my word count. So what I wanted to do was to tell the story in as vivid and lively a way as possible, of course to make it accurate, and to draw out the chain of cause and effect. Not just this happened and this also happened, but this caused this. This was caused by this. And I also wanted to bring in women's stories, because Japanese history is not all battles and samurai. There were very important women who shaped the course of Japanese history. So today I'm going to talk about some court ladies, some women warriors, and some courtesans. And I'm going to, at first at least, ask 3 questions. Question 1, who was this woman? Question 2, how did she get where she was? And question 3, how do we know about her? So the very first name in the whole of Japanese history, the first named person to arise in Japanese history is Himiko. And she lived just about 100 years after Boadicea, or Boudica. So she lived about 190 AD. And she was, while Boudica was a warrior queen, Himiko had a different kind of superpower. She was a shaman. And that meant that she could intervene with the gods. She could intercede with the gods. She could ensure that the harvests would come. She could ensure that the weather would be fine, that everybody would have good fortune. So how did she get to where she was? How did she become queen? So at that time, Japan was divided up into many, many, many kingdoms. And around 190 AD, 30 of the kings of these kingdoms got together and decided to make a federation. And they realized that while men ruled, they would carry on fighting each other all the time. So they decided the solution was to ask a woman to rule over them. And indeed, Himiko ruled for about 60 years. And she kept the peace throughout that time. Who was she? Well, she came from a line of queens. So there must have been women rulers before her that we don't know about. And how do we know about her? Well, at the time, Japan had no writing, but the great empire of China across the water did have writing. And when she was about 50, Himiko sent a delegation to the emperor of mighty China with tribute. And the tribute was of 10 slaves and bolts of silk. And the emperor of China received this tribute, and he recognized Himiko as the queen of the land of Wa, which is what the Chinese called her kingdom. And the Chinese did have writing. So the emperor of China was curious about this small kingdom across the water in these islands, way off at the edge of the Asian continent, and he sent a fact-finding mission. So a legation of Chinese arrived in Himiko's land, and they wrote a long report. And they reported that the people of the land of Wa lived in villages of thatched houses and grew all sorts of crops like barley, and that they dived for fish. Fish played a large part of their diet. And they were tattooed, some of them, from head to toe, which was to protect them from dangerous fishes. And they wrote that Himiko herself lived completely surrounded by a stockade with watchtowers and with an army to protect her, and with 1,000 women attendants to serve her, and one man who acted as her spokesperson. So she kept herself pretty much hidden, as indeed the emperor does to this day. But she wielded not only religious power, she was not only a shamaness, but also temporal power. And she charged taxes and so on, and while she ruled, the country was at peace. And they also reported that these people grew mulberry leaves, and they fed those to silkworms, and that they made very beautiful silk. And so we can imagine that Himiko looked and dressed something like this. So these people made haniwa. These were the yayoi people, which were dressed in the garments of the time. And so Himiko probably wore a tunic and a skirt, and of this beautiful silk that they wove. And also archaeologists have found their jewelry. they found the necklaces and coronets and so on that she would have worn. So she ruled for 50 years. And when she died, she was buried with enormous pomp and ceremony in a tumulus. It was one of the very first grave mounds. And she was buried, it is said, with either 100 or 1,000 living attendants. But the archaeologists tell us that that's not right, that the Japanese did not practice human sacrifice. But if she was buried in this tumulus, which is not certain, but this tumulus, this is Hashihaka tumulus, it's outside Nara, and it dates from the same period as Himiko. So it is possible, it is likely that this was her burial place. And in that case, her land, her kingdom, the land of Yamatai, would have been the Nara area. Though there are also people that contend that actually the land of Yamatai was in northern Kyushu. So if she wasn't buried with living attendants, she could well have been buried with haniwa, with terracotta attendants like these. And after her death, the people found a man to rule them, and immediately fighting broke out. So they kicked him out, and they installed her niece, who was called Io, who was 13 and who was also a shamaness, and peace was established again. So there's a lot of controversy, as you know, about whether a woman can inherit the chrysanthemum throne. And just the other day, the emperor's nephew was recognized as the heir apparent, as the crown prince, thereby leaping over the emperor's daughter, who's older than him. Well, this is because of very recent constitutions. I think in the Meiji constitution stated that only a man could inherit, could rule from the imperial throne. And that was reinforced by the American-based constitution of 1947. But before that, there were empresses. And quite a few immediately after Himiko. So I will tell you about 3 of these empresses quite briefly. So the first one was Empress Suiko. And Empress Suiko ruled from 593 to 628, so quite a long time ago. And she was the daughter of Emperor Kinmei, who received the first statues of the Buddha from the Koreans and the Chinese. So this, in her rule, in her reign, Buddhism came to Japan. And she ruled for 35 years, so there are quite a few pictures of her. And under her, the regent, whose name was Prince Shotoku, who was a very, very great and famous regent, established Buddhism and also established many Buddhist temples, established lots of Chinese culture in Japan. So after jumping over a few emperors, the next empress we come to is Empress Kogyoku. And Empress Kogyoku came to the throne in 642, and she ruled till 661. And in her reign, she presided over a very spectacular coup d'etat. Now, the situation was always in Japan that you had the kind of figurehead emperor or empress, and then you had the people who held the real power. And at her time, it was a clan called the Soga clan who held the power. Now, her son, Prince Naka, decided that it was time that the imperial family got the power back into their hands. And so he plotted. And there was a big party held at the palace, the Itabuki no Miya. And he ordered that all the gates be locked, and he smuggled in a sword, and there he lopped off the head of the young leader of the Soga clan. So that was the end of the power of the Soga clan. And Empress Kogyoku had to abdicate immediately because she was polluted by being in the presence of death. Now, probably at this point, Prince Naka had the power, but he didn't want to be the one that appeared to have the power. So her brother became emperor, and after her brother died, she became empress again with a new name because her name was polluted because of that death. So she became Empress Saimei. And she went down to Kyushu. She was about to actually lead an armada to fight the Koreans and Chinese who were threatening Kyushu, but then she died. And Prince Naka now finally took over power, and he became Emperor Tenji. He took the name Emperor Tenji. And he was a very magnificent emperor, and in his reign, it was a bit like the time of William the Conqueror, when a lot of French culture came to England. Under his reign, a lot of Tang China culture came to Japan, including Gagaku, for example, came over from China. And the ladies of his court dressed like ladies in the Tang Chinese court. So it was a time of great glamour and a lot of culture. Now, we come to the third of these was Empress Koken, who ruled from, where are we, 749 to 770. And her father was Emperor Shomu, who was the one who built the great Buddha in Nara. Unfortunately, he also bankrupted Japan while he was building the great Buddha, because he used up so much valuable metals. But anyway, she came to the throne, and she was rather sickly. She was rather ill. And a faith-healing, very low-ranking Buddhist monk called Dokyo healed her. He'd done a lot of austerities and he had magical powers. He was also young and handsome, and she liked him very much and took him to her bed. And she also gave him a lot of power. So he started to issue laws and to decide what was going to go on in the country. Well, at that point, the clan that had the power, or thought they ought to have the power, were the Fujiwara. And they rose up in rebellion against her and against Dokyo. And she sent out an army which defeated them and took the head of the Fujiwara leader. And in gratitude, she printed out 1 million sutras. So sutras are Buddhist scriptures. So this is where are we? This is 750. It's way, way, way before the Gutenberg press. So this is the first instance of printing in the world. And these sutras were put inside small pagodas, small stupas like this one, about this tall, of which there are some in the British Museum, and distributed around the 10 great monasteries. So Dokyo continued wielding power. She made him chancellor and then priestly emperor. But then he got a little above himself. He decided he wanted to be emperor, and that she wouldn't stand for. But she still favoured him until eventually she died. And at this point, the Fujiwara rose up and decided that they had to get rid of Dokyo immediately. And you couldn't execute him because you don't want to be haunted by a priest. That's really appalling. You don't want to do that. So they exiled him. But they also decreed that women could no longer inherit the imperial throne because they were too easily influenced. So that was the end. There were a couple more empresses about 1,000 years later, but that was the end of this kind of run of empresses. But that didn't mean that women didn't continue to play an important role. And there were women who changed the course of Japanese history through very different means. So we'll move on a few years to Murasaki Shikibu. And we are now about 1,000, we are around 1000 AD. That is before 1066. So over here, we are fighting each other. You have Wessex and Mercia and Northumberland and all that, and people are charging around with axes, sort of hacking each other to pieces. Or we're living in great halls, wearing helmets with horns on, drinking mead, listening to bards reciting the Epic of Beowulf, and most of us can't read. But over in Japan, it was very different. There, a most marvelous civilization grew up, centered around the beautiful city of Heian, which we now know as Kyoto. And it was laid out in a grid plan, as it is to this day, with magnificent palaces, like this one. This is an exact model of the Heian Palace, lining the boulevards of this marvelous city. And there, ladies and men trundled up and down the boulevards in ox-drawn carriages. So when I say ladies and men, we're talking about noble men and noble ladies, because as far as these people were concerned, the ordinary people were barely human at all. They really didn't count. So noble men and noble ladies. and the noble ladies made sure that they were never seen by the noble men. It was a very peculiar and extraordinary and very aesthetic, marvelously aesthetic culture. So these ladies would ensure that there was a beautiful sleeve, brocade sleeve, hanging from the window of their ox carriage, so that people would know that hidden inside was an extraordinarily beautiful woman. Well, a little anachronistic, but we can guess what these ladies look like, because there are these processions to this day where people dressed in Heian costume parade around Kyoto. And we can see that these ladies wore these wonderful 12-layer kimonos, which were color coordinated at the throat and at the wrist and at the hem. And they had this long, beautiful hair that swept down their back like a waterfall and trailed along the ground behind them. The only mistake in this costume is that in reality, the Heian ladies would have shaved off their eyebrows and they would have painted them in high on their forehead, moth's wing eyebrows like these. So the ladies kept themselves hidden away, and when a man came to visit, the lady would receive him from behind screens, so he didn't get to see her. Now, as I said, this was a very aesthetic culture, very literate culture, and people could write a poem just like that. So if a man was very interested in a particular lady, he would compose a poem, and he would write it in his best calligraphy on a piece of beautifully scented paper and have it sent in to her. And she would take a look at it, and she would assess it, and if she thought it was worth her while, she might answer. And if things developed well, she might invite him in to spend the night. So he would arrive at dead of night, so he didn't get to see her face. And they would be alone together in the darkness, apart from some 40 or 50 servants who didn't count because they weren't people. But the servants would be very discreet, but they would know exactly who the man was by his perfume, because each man mixed his own perfume, and they were all different. And the man would leave before cockcrow. So the men all learnt Chinese characters, so they wrote somewhat staid poems in Chinese characters. The ladies were considered to be an inferior species, so they were taught kana, hiragana. And the idea was that they should read the sutras and they should be very devout and pious. But these were extremely sophisticated court ladies. So they used this kana to write diaries and letters and accounts of all the funny things that they saw, all the ridiculous, the men preening themselves, and their sadness at things like falling in love with a man because of the sound of his voice and never being able to meet him, that kind of thing. And the pinnacle of all this was Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji, which I'm sure you've read, and if you haven't, then you should. It's about the shining Prince Genji, who was the most handsome and kind-hearted and charming and brilliant man, and who also had a streak of tragedy. Many people that he loved died, and it's all about feelings. It's all about relationships. It's all about emotions. It's not Beowulf. It's not fighting monsters. It's more like Proust or Jane Austen, and it's famed, very famed, as the world's first novel. And it actually forms the bedrock of Japanese culture ever after, with all the marvelous poems in it. So, such a decadent culture could not last forever. Such an effete culture. Though it did last for 400 years. And 400 years is actually quite a long time. 400 years ago from now is 1625, and a lot has happened since then. So this culture lasted for quite a long time. But eventually, the buildings were falling down. The government was they were so busy with their writing of poems and their mixing of perfumes that they forgot how to print money, for example. And they forgot to govern. And in the end, there were bands of monks fighting each other on the streets. There were robbers. The emperor hid himself in his palace. He was afraid to come out. And anybody that went traveling did so in fear and trembling. And eventually, the samurai, whose job it was to defend the effete nobles, charged in and took power themselves. And so began the age of warfare. Now, among these samurai, there were women. And the most famous of the whole lot was Tomoe Gozen. So Tomoe Gozen was pretty much a contemporary of Richard the Lionheart. So it's a similar period over here. And she was extremely beautiful. She had white skin and long black hair, and she was the companion, or probably the lover, of a man called Kiso no Yoshinaka, who was a very gallant warrior, who was the cousin of the first shogun of Japan, who was Minamoto no Yoritomo. And the shogun means he was the first person to try to unify Japan. So Yoshinaka was his cousin. And we know about Tomoe because her exploits are recorded in the Tale of the Heike, which was the great epic of the time. Whenever a battle was imminent, Yoshinaka sent her out as his first captain, equipped with strong armor, his first captain, an oversized sword and a mighty bow, and she performed more deeds of valor than any of his other warriors. So she was the leader of the troop of 300 who drove the enemy, who was the Taira, or the Heike, out of Kyoto. There was an army 2,000 strong of enemy, and she and her 300 men drove them out of Kyoto and fleeing to the western provinces. So she was a great horsewoman. She could tame wild horses, she could gallop down cliffs, but her weapon of choice was the naginata, which became the classic woman's weapon. This is the long-handled sword, which has a haft about 2 meters long, and a sharp blade 1 meter long. And this is the classic woman's weapon. So if you are a woman and a man with his 2 meter long sword is charging towards you, if you are nifty with your 3 meter long naginata, you could probably cut his legs off. Mm-hmm. So this was her weapon of choice. So all this was great, but then Yoshinaka got a bit above himself, this is her lover, and decided that he wanted to be shogun. He wanted to topple his cousin and be shogun himself. And obviously the shogun, Yoritomo, was not standing for this. So Yoritomo sent down a massive army led by the greatest warrior in the whole of Japanese history, who is Yoshitsune. And they came down, and there was a huge battle in 1184, which is the Battle of Awaza. And Tomoe and Yoshinaka were enormously outnumbered, and eventually there was nobody, none of their warriors were left apart from 5. And Yoshinaka called over Tomoe and said, "Flee, go to the eastern provinces, make sure that my story is not forgotten." But she was a warrior. She said, no way. She wanted to show him what a glorious death she could die. So she looked around for a worthy opponent. And she saw a poor chap called, what's he called? Honda no Moroshige, the head of the Musashi clan. So she rode up to him, grabbed him, pulled him off his horse, held his head up against the pommel of her saddle and cut it off. And she then looked around for Yoshinaka, her lover, to give him the head. But unfortunately his horse, this is rather a humiliating ending, his horse had sunk to its withers in a paddy field, and he was full of arrows and had been killed. So then she did take off her armour, suddenly appeared to be just like an ordinary woman, and run off to the eastern provinces and lived a long life, and so his story was told. So we're now going to move on a little further to a woman who wielded power in a very traditional way from behind the throne. And the sad thing is we don't have any pictures of Nene as a young girl, so you're going to have to imagine what she looked like. She was a contemporary, pretty much, of Elizabeth I. So we're now in Tudor times. And she was born in the kingdom of Owari, which is around Nagoya, around there, which was also the kingdom of Oda Nobunaga, who was the great warlord of the day, who was in the middle of unifying Japan. And she was the daughter of quite a mid-ranking samurai family. So her parents wanted her very much to marry a high-ranking samurai, and there were lots of handsome young high-ranking samurai who were keen to marry her. But there was also a scrawny, very ugly bloke who was of farming ancestry, therefore very low ranking, absolutely not a catch at all, and he was so ugly that people called him Monkey. His name was Tokichido, and she went for him. Well, he was scrawny, ugly, and everything else, but he also was a genius, and he had an amazing tongue. He was able to persuade anybody to do anything, and he was also able to make most people laugh. And Oda Nobunaga, the great warlord, had already spotted him and made him his sandal bearer. And so her husband, Monkey, or Tokichido, rose very rapidly through the ranks to stable boy, gardener, and then Nobunaga tried him out on the battlefield. He was a genius at tactics, so he became a general, and by now he had a new name, which was Hideyoshi. And he was out and about on campaign all the time. And how do we know about Nene? Because he wrote to her. He wrote her tons and tons of letters, and he consulted her about everything, including battlefield tactics and all sorts of practical things like, do we charge, the peasants around our castle? How much tax should we charge them? So by now, he was a daimyo. He was a warlord, and he had his first castle, which was Nagahama Castle in Shigaken. And so Nene's job was to stay at home and to be the daimyo. So she ran the castle, she was in charge of policing, she reared their adopted children. She couldn't have any children of her own. She took care of his mother. And she ran the kind of justice of the castle. So there was one problem from her point of view, which was that any man worth his salt in those days had quite a few ladies other than his wife. And Hideyoshi took this rather far. He had about 100 concubines. And so Oda Nobunaga, the great warlord, at one point writes to Nene like this: "Your beauty grows day by day. Tokichiro complains about you," that's Hideyoshi, "complains about you constantly, and it is outrageous. While that bald rat flusters around trying to find another good woman, you remain lofty and elegant. Do not be jealous. Show Hideyoshi this letter." I love this because I think you can hear the voice of Nobunaga and you can see Nene. You can also see Hideyoshi, that bald rat. Well, shortly after this, I think tragically, that's my opinion, Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582. And by now Hideyoshi was his right-hand man, and he became Kampaku, which is regent. So he rose right to the pinnacle. And Nene, his wife, was like the queen. So she was higher in rank than any daimyo. So she was, at this point, incredibly powerful, able to communicate with the emperor whenever she felt like it. But there was, besides those 100 concubines, there was one new concubine, which really was a problem. The 100 concubines, that was okay. Women were used to, it was the job of a wife to run the household and make sure the concubines didn't squabble, that was all fine. But there was this new, young, beautiful concubine who was called Yodo-dono, Lady Yodo. And she was Oda Nobunaga's niece. So she was posh, unlike Nene, who was not, and she was the daughter of Nobunaga's beautiful sister, whose name was Lady Oichi. And so basically, Hideyoshi was in the process of completing the unification of Japan. There were two clans still left to pacify. One was the Hojo of Odawara, and the other was Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of Oshu, who I only mentioned because I love him being the one-eyed dragon of Oshu. But at the moment I'm talking about, Hideyoshi decided to besiege the castle of the Hojo in Odawara. And he knew this was going to be a really long and boring siege. So while the people inside the castle were starving, he decided his men outside the castle needed to be having fun. So he summoned fire eaters, sword swallowers, storytellers, dancers, jesters, musicians, and he told his generals to summon their wives and their concubines. Now, he had a problem, which was he really wanted Yodo to come, but he didn't want to annoy Nene. So he wrote to Nene like this: We have got the enemy like birds in a cage. I wish to send for Yodo. I wish you to tell her and make arrangements for her journey, and tell her that next to you, she is the one that pleases me best. Your skill is the best in this world, and our wish is always the same. So he's obviously trying to make sure that Nene stays on side. And in fact, Yodo did go and join him. Now there was one thing, none of these 100 concubines had produced an heir for Hideyoshi. He had no heir, he had no child. Now Lady Yodo succeeded. She had 2 children. The first was called Tsurumatsu, and he died when he was 2.5, and Hideyoshi was distraught. But then she had another son, Hideyori, and he lived on. I should add that there was no DNA testing in those days, but Hideyoshi was sure that these were definitely his children. And so basically, Yodo was the concubine, so she was the one whose job it was to be delightful and charming and beautiful, and Nene was the official wife, so she was the one that reared the children. And finally, Hideyoshi had succeeded in pacifying and unifying the whole country, and it was at peace. And this was the Momoyama age. It was a time of unbelievable culture and glamour, when people wore the most glorious robes, and the first magnificent castles were being built, and peasants and serfs were coming in from the countryside and establishing new jobs, establishing new professions as artisans and merchants. So it was kind of the beginning of modern Japan. And Hideyoshi himself, he set up Nene in the Jurakute, which was this palace, it was in northern Kyoto. It's not there anymore. Beautiful golden palace. And there he had parties. And at one point, he had a tea ceremony party. It was a 10-day tea ceremony party. And he invited every single inhabitant of Kyoto. And all they had to bring was their own mat and their own bowl. And there he showed off his magnificent solid gold tea ceremony house and his solid gold tea ceremony utensils. So basically he was of farming stock. So, he was like a nouveau riche. He really wanted to be cultured. He learned no dancing, and he was keen on tea ceremony. Well, this 10-day tea ceremony party only lasted one day because he got bored. So after one day, they closed it down. But 10 years later, he had a cherry blossom viewing party. He's getting rather old by now. And there's a wonderful reenactment of this party every year. It was at Daigoji in the south of Kyoto. And there he completely refurbished Sambo-in, which is this wonderful rock garden where he filled it with 800 incredibly expensive rocks of very beautiful shapes from all over Japan. And there all the ladies in their magnificent costumes paraded through the city. Well, so Japan was at peace, but the problem was that there were quite a lot of unemployed samurai. And Hideyoshi was very concerned that these unemployed samurai were going to get up to mischief or possibly rise in rebellion. And the obvious thing to do was to declare war on Korea and China. So he did. And he sent off an armada over to Korea. There were huge and terrible battles. I think something like 1 million Koreans were killed and something like 100,000 Japanese. It was really appalling. And Nene really thought this was an atrocious idea, and she was in a position where she could speak to the emperor. And she said to the emperor, "Can you stop him? Please stop him from doing this." And the emperor was obviously afraid of Hideyoshi. So he sent him a note saying, "Excuse me, this might not be the best of ideas." But then, to everybody's relief, Hideyoshi died. And they immediately called back the troops, called back the navy. And Nene, we finally get to see her in old age. She took the tonsure, which is what you did. That didn't mean she had any less power. It didn't mean she went off to a nunnery, nothing like that. She also didn't shave her head, she cut her hair. But she took a new name. She became known as Kodayin. And her temple in Kyoto is Kodaiji. So Nene lived to a ripe old age, and she rose from very, modest origins to a position of incredible power and influence. Meanwhile, a lot of other women had a very, very hard time because the centuries of warfare meant that there were a lot of destitute women who really had a hard time making ends meet, and they had no choice but to engage in prostitution. So they became prostitutes, and there were a lot of prostitutes roaming around in Japan. So we'll just wind the clock on a little further, not very far, to somebody called Izumono Okuni, and she lived around 1603. Around 1603, which was during the reign of James I and 2 years before the gunpowder plot. So in 1603, Izumono Okuni set up a stage in the dry bed of the river Kamo. She was a shrine maiden and a courtesan, which was not a contradiction in terms. And there she began to do wild and outrageous dancing. And the most outrageous of all was when she donned 2 swords like a samurai, and did dances as a man and did comic skits. And after the shows, a lot of men queued up to enjoy her sexual favours, so it was very good for business. And the other courtesans and prostitutes in Kyoto noticed this, and soon they were all doing wild and outrageous dancing. And a name had to be found for this absolutely new art form, and that name was Kabuki, which came from, I think, from kabuku or from katamuku, which means to do something which is kind of offbeat or aslant. And so there was, basically the Tokugawa shoguns had no problem with sexual morality. There was no Judeo-Christian fuss about that, but they did not want disorder. By now, as I'm sure you know, I forgot to mention, the Tokugawa shoguns were running the show. And they did not like disorder at all. And there was a lot of disorder among the men lining up, fighting for the favours of all these courtesans and prostitutes. So eventually they banned women from performing on the public stage. So that meant that thereafter women could perform to parlour audiences, to paying private audiences, but not on the public stage. So the women were replaced by beautiful young men, and the same problem arose, that men lined up to enjoy the favours of the beautiful young men, so they got banned as well. And so then the shogunate decreed that hereafter only men, adult men, could appear on the public stage, as they do to this day. This is Tamasaburo. Those of you amongst us who are a little older will remember wonderful Tamasaburo. And so to this day, Kabuki and No is performed only by men. So basically, this is some of the point of this is that the world of the courtesans and the prostitutes was very intimately connected with showbiz. It was a lot to do with dancing and with music and with performance. And so there were all these courtesans and prostitutes milling around all over the place. And the question was how to establish order. This was very disorderly. So the answer was gather them together in one place. So government-sponsored pleasure quarters began. And the very first one was actually at the time of Hideyoshi. It was the Shimabara, and it was founded in 1589 outside Kyoto, a decent distance outside Kyoto, so you had to travel to get there, so that it wouldn't pollute respectable people. But the most famous pleasure quarters of the whole lot was outside the great city of Edo, which was the Tokugawa shogun's new capital, and that was the Yoshiwara. And it was known as the city, it was known as the nightless city, because the lights never went out. And it was made up of 5 streets, and it was a place where a man who spent his days maybe being humiliated at work, maybe being beaten down, maybe being nagged by his wife even, could go up there and he could imagine himself a prince. And he could imagine that the courtesan who was declaring her eternal love for him was a princess. So it was a place where a man could enact any fantasy he chose to enact. And anybody could go there. It was up the Sumida River. It was a bit of a journey, but anyone could go there. It didn't cost anything. Women could go there. And this painting is by Hokusai's daughter, Katsushika Oi. And she depicts the Yoshiwara as a fun place. I don't think this is a critical depiction of the Yoshiwara. So if you were a poor man, you could walk around the streets, you could walk in, you could walk around the streets, you could admire these beautiful ladies behind the lattices, showing off their wares, which was their beauty. If you had a little bit of money, you might be able to spend an hour or so with one of these ladies. And even if you had no money, you could still see one of the great courtesans parading down the road if you were lucky. And you could spot these courtesans. It was very easy to spot them, but they had these 30-centimetre high clogs, and they undulated down the road in a long procession. And they wore their obi, the bow of their obi, tied at the front in an enormous knot. The implication being that if you were rich enough and patient enough and lucky enough, you might, just possibly might, have the chance to untie it. So these were the most marvellous processions, and if you were a poor man, you could certainly enjoy them. In fact, they're so marvellous that they are repeated to this day with these enormous obis. So these ladies are now actresses. Now, if you were a rich man, that was a different business altogether. You wouldn't be on the street, you would go straight to the courtesan's boudoir, and you would have booked her, and there you would wait. And while you were waiting, you would need to demonstrate that you were worthy of her interest because you were such a big spender. So you'd have to call in dancers, singers, jesters, storytellers, all at enormous expense, and also food for all these entertainers, and food for yourself, lavish feasts for all these people, and you would wait. It could take her all day before she showed up. It could take longer, she might have other customers. But eventually, the courtesan would appear, and you would glimpse, perhaps, her little bare foot, suggesting the human woman inside all this fancy outfit. Now, these ladies, basically, because of, let's think, value added, it would decrease their value if they were to go to bed with just anybody. So quite a few of them didn't go to bed with anybody at all. So the odds of you actually untying that obi were very small indeed. And as I said, what it was really all about was much more about culture. In fact, what Seidensticker wrote was that an evening at the Yoshiwara was a bit like an afternoon of tea. So the courtesan would probably play music for you. She looks a little bit prim, as you can see, on her kokyu. Or she might do tea ceremony with 2 trainee courtesans to help her. She would certainly dance for you. But these ladies were also, they were like queens of salons, because there were salons in the Yoshiwara. And the Yoshiwara was actually the heart of the whole of the Edo period culture. So all those wonderful woodblock prints depict the Yoshiwara, or they depict the world of the pleasure quarters. And novels like Saikaku's marvellous novels come out of the pleasure quarters. So poets and artists would gather in the salons where the courtesans were the queens. So they were celebrities. They were celebrities. And they were certainly not going to undo their obi for just any old guy. Far from it. So some 150 years went by to about 1750. Now, 150 years is quite a long time. 150 years ago was 1875. No electricity, no gas. That's a long time. So 150 years went by, and some of these women were really into their arts. So if they were dancers, they were pros. It was like the Royal Ballet. If they were singers, they were professionals, like opera singers today. I mean, like Western opera singers. So they were not amateurs. These were fantastic performers. And some of these women realized that they absolutely did not need to sell their bodies, not at all. They could make a living by selling their arts. And they called themselves arts people, which was Geisha. And back to the courtesan. Here was the courtesan with her obi tied at the front and all her makeup and her incredibly heavy headdress and everything else. The geisha were very different. They were into their arts. They tied their obi at the back. They didn't bother with the thick makeup because that was not their job. And they were really, if a teacher of dancing came to town, they went rushing to see him. They were really interested in their profession. They were professionals. And so, over the years, it became far cooler for a young man about town to be seen with an understated geisha on his arm than an over-made-up, overdressed courtesan. And when the Westerners finally turned up, the geisha who were trendsetters were the first to try out things like, bustles and bonnets, Western clothing, and Western dancing. And even when somebody had to dance with the ghastly hairy Westerners at the Dokumekan, the Hall of the Baying Stag, well, men's wives didn't want to do that, but Geisha didn't mind. So, as I said, 1853 is the year when all of this jollity came to an end, when Commodore Matthew Perry showed up with his 4 black ships with cannons blazing and forced the Japanese to open up to, interaction with the West. And that sparked 15 years first of trouble, then of more trouble, then of war, civil war, and eventually in 1868, Emperor Mutsuhito, who was 15, came down from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, eastern capital, and entered Edo Castle, which was renamed the Imperial Palace. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. There was a Tokugawa resistance. There were a lot of resistance warriors, and among these resistance warriors, there were women. And the most famous is Nakano Takako. So the Tokugawa resistance gathered at Aizu Castle, which is just about, it's not very far from Fukushima. And for a very good reason, there is no Aizu prefecture, not at all. So the new government, which was made up of the clans which had been the ancient enemies of the Tokugawa clan, the Satsuma, the Choshu mainly, sent a mammoth army up, and they besieged Aizu Castle, where the Tokugawa resistance were holed up. And the women were bandaging the wounds of the wounded, the women inside the castle. Some of the women killed themselves so as not to eat the food, so the men would have more food. And quite a few engaged in battle. So one day the army was outside the castle and suddenly the gates opened and a brigade came out. And the army took one look at them and realized that these were women. They'd cut their hair short, they were wearing headbands, and their leader was Nakano Takako. So for a moment, the cry went up in the army to hold fire. So the women charged in with their naginata. They didn't have guns, they just had their long-handled swords, and they sliced a few men up. But then the men started to fire, and she was killed straight away. And her sister cut off her head, so that the enemy could not have it as a trophy. And shortly after that, that resistance crumbled. Then the resistance moved up to Hokkaido, and finally the whole thing came to an end, and the Meiji period began. So for the next 30, 40 odd years, it was a period of nation building. And this was not a great time for women. There was the first constitution, and the constitution decreed that women were to be good wives and wise mothers. In other words, stay home and keep quiet. So it was not a great time for women, but eventually the nation building was over. And then came, around 1910, the Jazz Age, the Taisho period. And this, by now, the country is established, there is universal education, and this is the age of the Moga, or the modern Garu. So the Moga were flappers. Not everybody was a Moga, but there were quite a few Mogas. They had shockingly short skirts. They had shockingly short hair, and they had jobs. They could be beauticians, secretaries, elevator attendants, they could be waitresses, but they could be financially independent. And there were waitresses, as in Tanizaki's famous story about Naomi, a fool's love, who could make their own decision about where they dispensed their sexual favours. So these women smoked, ate ice cream, did the can-can, roamed around the Ginza, drove around in fast cars or were driven, practiced free love when they felt like it, and discussed Marxism, anarchism, socialism, and all those other very exciting things. This is the 1910s, 1920s. And among them, there were militant feminists, of whom the most famous was Hiratsuka Raicho. So Hiratsuka Raicho very famously said that marriage was slavery by day and prostitution by night. So she certainly didn't bother getting married. She went off with a married man, and that didn't work out. So she then moved on to a much younger man and had some children by him, but didn't actually get married to him until eventually her children were grown up. And she founded a magazine called Seito, which means blue stocking, where she published extremely risque stories by women authors all about their sex lives. Women weren't supposed to have sex lives, but these were very stories about things like picking up a man in a bar and having sex with him. So this was all very shocking, but the government didn't do anything about it until she started demanding women's rights, and she also started criticizing capitalism. So then at that point, the government clamped down. But her most famous contributor was Yosano Akiko, who was a famous poetess. And she too went off with a married man. She had, some say 11, some say 13 children. It should be quite easy to check that, but either 11 or 13 children. And she wrote Midare Gami, which is tangled hair, which is about, these are erotic, very erotic poems about her love for him. And women were not supposed to have erotic thoughts of any sort, let alone write poems about it. So these women took their lives into their own hands, and their power was their independence. So the very first words of Seito, of blue stocking, were, in the beginning, woman was the sun. And this is a reference to Amaterasu, who is the sun goddess, who's the creator of all life. And actually Amaterasu is with us to this day. She's just as powerful as she ever was, because she's become a very fashionable or very popular figure in manga. So I write about all of this and much else in The Shortest History of Japan. And there are copies on sale if you are interested in buying a copy. I could sign them with my special signing pen, and stamp it with the gold stamp of the Tokugawa shoguns, the hollyhock crest of the Tokugawa shoguns in gold. So, goseichou arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you very much.